C.S. Lewis lived with his brother, Warren Lewis, for many years. Warren Lewis had been in the Army, and after early retirement, he then moved in with his brother, lived with him for the rest of C.S. Lewis's life. Even lived with him after Lewis married, and Lewis didn't marry until he was in his 50s. He married an American lady, Joy Davidman Gresham. And we do have a book that Lewis wrote, Mere Christianity, the copy that he gave to Joy when they first met. We have over here all the first editions of Lewis's books published during his lifetime, both British and American, and many books from Lewis's own library, some of which have notes in them. Then on that side are the books of George MacDonald, the man that Lewis considered his master and his favorite author. One particular set of books I'd like to show you, this set of first editions that we have of the Chronicles, and before we get into the story, I can't resist reading what I think is the best opening of any book. After you finish with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, you might want to read the rest of them, and The Voyage of the Dawn Treader begins like this. There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. His parents called him Eustace Clarence, and masters called him Scrubb. I can't tell you how his friends spoke to him, for he had none. He didn't call his father and mother, but Harold and Alberta. They were very up-to-date and advanced people. They were vegetarians, non-smokers, and teetotalers, and wore a special kind of underclothes. In their house there was very little furniture and very few clothes on the beds, and the windows were always open. Eustace Clarence liked animals, especially beetles if they were dead and pinned on a card. He liked books if they were books of information and had pictures of grain elevators or of fat foreign children doing exercises in model schools. That gives you some of his prejudices or beliefs about things, one of which he liked books of imagination better than books of information. But the fact that he said Eustace Clarence Scrubb was his name, and he almost deserved it. C.S. Lewis, you might wonder, what does C.S. stand for? It stands for Clive Staples. So you can see that he felt probably a little bit about his own name as the name he made up, Eustace Clarence Scrubb. Now, I have this particular set out because it has a special story behind it. Dr. Brown, who lives in Indianapolis and started this collection and from whom we purchased it, picked up at one time this copy, first edition of Prince Caspian. And in it, it says, to Penelope Berners Price from C.S. Lewis, with the date. Now, Dr. Brown then wondered who was Penelope Berners Price and what was the relationship. So, what would you do if you wanted to find out something about a person named Berners Price? Probably the very same thing that Dr. Brown did. Enter it into Google and find some people by that name. He found someone who knew Penelope. Of course, now she's not a little girl anymore, but Dr. Brown traveled to England and met this Penelope to get the story behind the relationship. Before we get to the relationship itself, would like to say that she said that she had had all of the books, Narnian books, as they came out, so she had all the first editions. But because of financial difficulties, the collection had gotten scattered and she didn't know where they were. Well, if you know anything about collectors, this was like waving a red flag in front of a bull for the collector, Dr. Brown. He wanted to find these other books if he could. I think it's rather amazing that he was able to find 6 of the 7 books that she had. He could tell they were hers because in all of them she had her own book plate. And so that book plate was in all of the books. He did not find one of them, so what he did was he took a generic first edition that he already had over to her, had her sign it as an adult, and then was able to put the book plate in it. So then he had a complete set of books that were connected with Penelope Berner's Prize, all but one with the actual copy she had as a little girl. He then took all of the books to the illustrator of the books, Pauline Baines, and had her sign each of the books. This was very timely because Pauline Baines lived only a couple years after Dr. Brown was able to get her signature on all of them. So then he had a complete set. All were signed by Pauline Baines, and 2 of them were signed by Lewis. And in some of them, Penelope wrote, "This was given me by C.S. or "I bought this one with my own money," little statements like that that the little girl wrote in the books. Now, the relationship is what's the most interesting part of the story, I believe. Penelope's parents ran a hotel, and one day a woman checked into the hotel, said she was the wife of C.S. Lewis, and that her husband would be joining her in a few days and would take care of the bill. Well, in a few days, she said her husband had been delayed and he'd be coming next week. She kept putting them off until finally then she skipped out without paying the bill. So Penelope's mother went to Oxford and presented C.S. Lewis with a bill for his wife's hotel stay. C.S. Lewis said, "But I don't have a wife." He wasn't married at the time. This was a scam that this woman would do. She would go around, check into a hotel, say she was the wife of some fairly famous person, one that they would have heard of, but not so famous that they would know she was a fake, and then enjoy the comforts of the room and room service and all the rest, and then skip out. Well, actually, she was caught, and Lewis had to testify at her trial, and she was put in prison for a while. So that's how they met. Then, of course, Lewis became friends with the family, and later on, when he married, I believe he and his wife did stay in their hotel, but he was friends with the family. I do not know whether he ever paid for his false wife's stay or not. That I don't know. I mentioned that Pauline Baines was the illustrator. Over here, we have a map of Narnia, which Pauline Baines wrote, which Pauline Baines drew, with places marked that are in the stories, like Lantern Waste, where the lantern was, where Lucy met the fawn, and of course other parts. I mentioned his wife. He married Joy Davidman, and I said she lived for several years after he died. And there's a Hollywood movie that was made of the romance between Lewis and his wife called Shadowlands. So you might get to see that sometime. It tells about them. Now there's one more thing I would like to show you. Another book that we have. It's a pop-up book. And there is a page for each of the chronicles, and so I'd like to show you the page for The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Then there is a flap over here which can be opened, and you see the White Witch on her sledge, but also the wardrobe doors open and you see the children. Each page has a different one of the chronicles.
How about these books? Can you tell us?
Over here we have the 3-volume set of Lewis's letters. Lewis wrote many, many letters, as you can tell, and obviously many of his letters have been lost. But this is the ones that have been collected. And the letters that we own are reproduced in that collection. He didn't like to write letters, but after he became famous, many people wrote asking him questions, and he felt like it was his duty to respond to these letters. And so he would answer these letters usually the next morning after he got them, so he would get it over with and have the rest of the day to do more pleasant things. So even though he did not like to write letters, he felt it was his duty, and he did his duty. And there's wonderful material in the letters. There are passages that are as good as anything in the books that he published.